technology has really boomed in the last several decades. We see news anchors talking alongside animations and videos, whereas beforehand they just used to talk directly to you, didn't have any accompanying visuals usually. We also see a very rapid rise in online course offerings where instructional web modules are used to deliver primary course content. And we really moved sort of from a traditional lecture style, maybe a medieval lecture style, and typically an instructor stood in front of a lectern and usually read from a primary source to an audience who tried to copy down as much information into their notes as possible. And this was very much the fundamental unit of academic life, transferring knowledge from the instructor to the student. And in very many ways, this process is still the same, except now we supplement the lectern experience with multimedia software. So things like PowerPoint presentations or keynote presentations. But the big question and the big issue that we're going to discuss today is that, like many things in life that are not created equal, like these two guys, not all multimedia presentations are necessarily created equal. So you can have really well-designed presentations that promote engagement and learning, and you can have really poorly designed presentations that overwhelm an audience with too much visual text and actually detract from learning and promote boredom. So just to give you a feel for how ubiquitous this instructional technology is, first we're going to look at how multimedia exists in the wild. So for us, that means outside of an educational context. So I'm sure we've all turned on the TV and we want to catch up on some news, and we come across a very typical news broadcast where there's multiple screens of animations. Perhaps there's also some weather information jammed in a corner, and to top it all off, usually there's also some sort of scrolling news ticker. And there's a lot of information that you have to take in, and it can be extremely overwhelming. And this overuse of visual information to convey information is common in many contexts. So we also see this issue arise in another example. So a New York Times headline ran that said, "We have met the enemy, and he is PowerPoint." And this is an actual slide that was delivered as a briefing to General MacArthur, who was in charge of the Afghanistan mission at the time. And he was so appalled by the way information was presented to him that when he left, he ran into reporters and he said, "When we understand that slide, we'll have won the war." And this is a really good demonstration of just presenting way too much information to even an expert in the field who walks away really having taken away nothing meaningful. And we see a lot of this overuse of visual information also present in higher education, where it's very common for a student to walk into a lecture and to be bombarded with just bullet points of text. And as you can imagine, this is a really overwhelming learning scenario. Perhaps maybe the lights are dimmed and now the task is more perceptually challenging. And maybe also there's some sort of images that you have to reconcile in terms of graphs or flowcharts. And a lot of times a student's approach to dealing with this learning situation is essentially to become a court transcriber, where you're just trying to copy down as fast as humanly possible whatever's on that screen into your notes. So at some later point in time, usually before a midterm or a final, you'll revisit your notes where you really engage with it and learn from it for the first time. So there's no actual in-class learning taking place, which is a huge problem. And as you can see from this lady's face, she doesn't look too enthused with her experience, right? She looks a little bit bored. And we run the risk of doing this to our students as well and creating learning scenarios where they're really disengaged. So the big question is, though, how do we make decisions about instructional design? There's obviously so many choices that we have, so many different paths that we can take. And I'm really going to try to convince you that we should be paying attention to the science behind instructional design, which is based on a very rich understanding of human memory and attention. And this field provides very valid reasons for when you should use things like text in your presentations, or when it's better to use images, or sometimes when it's good to combine both, and that's what's optimal for learning. So why design instruction based on science? So the first reason that I'm going to give you is that learning is very clearly either helped or hindered depending on the visuals that you use to convey information. So this branch of research over the years has developed multimedia design strategies, which really try to outline when and why it's good to use text and images. So researchers in this field have asked questions like, should we use text in our presentations? Is more the better? Or should we just use text that conveys the main points and subpoints and elaborate on the rest through narration or speech? What about images? Are they really good for learning? If so, should they be really engaging and visually complex? Or again, should they be simple and just convey the main point? And obviously these are important questions in every educational domain, but especially when we get into domains like medical education, where now you're dealing with a population of students who are going to have to transfer what they learn within a classroom to the most real-world context that you can imagine, right? They're going to be dealing with the health and well-being of actual human bodies. So obviously the way that they learn information within a class really needs to transfer to that real-world environment. So perhaps they have to learn the anatomy of the heart. How should they learn this information? Should they learn with really simple 2D images, again, that just convey the main point? Or should they learn it with more perceptually detailed images that clearly have texture and color and that are more detailed, essentially? Or should they be learning this information with animations? Things that have actual movement and potentially can be rotated in a 3D manner. And so there's a lot of different design strategies and principles, and I've really tried to, over the last several years, investigate them with actual research in real controlled lab-based studies. And one of the principles that I've really tried to focus on has been this verbal redundancy principle. At least that's what is referred to in the actual literature. And what it suggests is that when you present verbal information, it can be in the form of written text, obviously in the form of these bullet points, and it can also be in the form of narration or speech. And there's an underlying cognitive explanation for why typically this presentation style is very detrimental to learning, and it's based on a limited working memory capacity assumption. And this framework suggests that humans have a finite amount of attentional resources that they can allocate to any given task at any given moment. So if you enter a learning scenario, typically you have a full tank of these resources, and you're ready to learn. What does that say? I don't have my glasses. I have no idea what that said, but anyways. So you have a full tank of these resources, and when you enter a learning scenario, you use these resources to pay attention to the right thing in your learning environment and inhibit distraction for irrelevant information. Once you've paid attention to the right thing, to organize that into a coherent representation and take information from long-term memory and integrate it with this new information that you have. And so obviously there's multiple steps that require these limited resources that you have. But what happens is, depending on how you present information to a learner, so if it's really overwhelming or distracting, then these resources quickly become depleted and you run towards empty. And what happens is there's a lot less resources left over to really engage with the information in a meaningful way. And that's when learning tends to suffer. So when you have a multimedia presentation, you only take in information obviously through two senses, through your eyes and through your ears. So when you have a redundant text presentation style, all of that information is bombarding your visual processing stream, right? So you have to take all that information in, and what happens is when you have overlapping narration, now there's sort of a competition for your attention. You don't know whether to pay attention to the on-screen text, the auditory text, where should your attention be geared towards? And so this reconciliation of competing sources of verbal input is what consumes a lot of those limited resources. So that's when learning should suffer. Now, instead of using a lot of verbal text, there's an image superiority principle which says use images. So for example, if you are trying to convey this information about a heart, such as it has chambers, veins, and arteries, then if you use an image, learners are going to have superior memory for that information with the image than the verbal description. And one of the underlying explanations for that is an image clearly has much richer perceptual detail, right? You have color and shape and texture. If it was moving, you'd have dynamic flow. And the memory literature is very clear about the fact that if you learn from an item that's much richer in perceptual detail, you're going to encode all of that information. And so when it comes to a time when you want to remember that information, let's say before an assessment or during an assessment, that information was processed at such a deeper level that it's going to be so much more easily retrievable than if you learned it with the verbal information. So use images, not text, or not excessive verbal text. So what we tried to do is, obviously we have these multiple principles, and we wanted to run them with actual multimedia instruction with real educationally relevant material to see if they hold true. And so we designed several multimedia templates. So we have a redundant text presentation on the left here, and essentially there's bullet points of verbatim text. Now there's overlapping narration on top of this through an audio track. And there's also a complementary presentation that tries to tap into that image superiority principle. And it presents relevant images that just complement the narration. So there's no verbally redundant text. And so these two presentations obviously try to tap into both of those principles, redundancy and image, but we also just had an audio-only condition that essentially functioned as a control. And so participants came into our lab, and they sat in front of a computer screen with headphones, and they watched one of these three presentations, and they were told, learn as much as you can, because afterwards you're going to complete a comprehension quiz that assesses how much you learned. So we did that, and in terms of comprehension performance, when we look at the y-axis, it's just the percentage correct on that quiz. And these two conditions right here, audio and redundant, you see that there's no group differences. So regardless of whether you're learning information essentially from a podcast, or you have all of that extra visual information in the form of text, you're learning the same. Which is really interesting, because all of that extra visual information provided nothing. Now when you look at the complementary condition, you clearly see a benefit for using these engaging visuals that complement the narration. So there is support for this image superiority principle. Now what's also interesting is that with this particular experiment, we also had participants rate what they thought about their presentation. So, never mind. First of all, so this is just to drive home the point that there's clearly letter grade differences that can result from just the way that you present information if this was a real classroom. So that is a full letter grade difference. So we also had participants rate what they thought about their presentations, and in terms of subjective perception ratings, so they rated how interesting they found their presentation. And so they rated their agreement with statements like, I found the presentation material interesting on a scale from 1 to 4, 1 being they absolutely disagreed with it, 4 being they absolutely agreed with it. And they also rated a series of other subjective measures, like how engaged they were with the material, how difficult they found it, and how much they thought that their presentation helped them understand the content. And what's really interesting is that irrespective of whether participants were in the redundant condition or the complementary condition, all of these perception ratings were rated equally. Now the audio condition, nobody really likes it because it's probably boring, so it was always rated lower. But there's no differences in terms of the subjective feeling for redundant and complementary presentations, despite the fact that complementary is producing more learning. So what this seems to suggest is that learners aren't really aware of the hindrance that redundant text is for their learning. And they're also not aware of the benefits of complementary presentation styles. But I'm sure some people are a little sketched out by that particular conclusion, because this was a between subjects design, right? So a person that's assigned to a redundant text condition has no idea that these other conditions even exist. So they have no method of comparison. They can't say, well, I'm in a condition that's detrimental to my learning because there's other presentations that have images, which might be more engaging, right? They don't have that method of comparison. So we wanted to resolve this particular methodological flaw by turning the between subjects design into a within subjects design. So participants would come into our lab and not only within the same experimental session see a redundant text style, but they'd also be exposed to a complementary presentation style. So the idea is now we can assess whether participants are more aware of a condition that is effective for their learning versus another. And so again, just to walk you through a little bit more detail in terms of methodology. So first they would watch, the first half of the presentation was presented with this redundant text style. Now after the first half of the presentation was over, they rated on a series of subjective measures what what they thought about that presentation. And after that first half was done, the second half of the presentation continued, but with a different format, now the complimentary style. And after that second half was done, again, they rated what they thought about that half of the presentation, so the complimentary version. And so now they should technically have a method of comparison, especially since all of this was counterbalanced. So some people saw complimentary first and redundant second. So they should be able to more accurately assess when they're in a condition that's good versus bad for their learning. So if we look at subjective perception results, so this is just the scale from 1 to 4, and we see that the redundant condition is perceived as a lot better able to facilitate understanding relative to the complementary condition. And in terms of difficulty, we see that the redundant condition is perceived as a lot less difficult to understand. So there's clearly a positive sway towards redundant text in terms of how people feel about it. But the big kicker is when you look at comprehension performance and you see that the redundant presentation is actually producing a lot less learning compared to the complementary condition. So clearly there's a mismatch between what learners are preferring subjectively and what's actually good for their learning. And again, just to emphasize, this is again almost a full letter grade difference, which is pretty big in an educational context. So in terms of conclusions, clearly there's a bias for redundant text in the absence of meaningful learning, and even providing access to a good presentation style, starting to echo, doesn't seem to influence this bias whatsoever. And perhaps this last point is a working hypothesis, but maybe there's some sort of vicious cycle that's being perpetuated between instructor and student that's allowing redundant text to be so common in educational settings. And so this last point is suggesting that perhaps through repeated educational exposure, students are very familiar and comfortable with redundant text presentations, and they might mistake that sense of familiarity as reflecting good learning when they're exposed to it. And so when it comes to rating their instructors' use of technology in the classroom, they might rate them highly because they think all that text is good for their learning. They might actually go out of their way to encourage their instructors to use more text because they think it supports their learning. So like I said, it's very much a working hypothesis, but I think there's some valid points that should be investigated further. So like anything in life, there are exceptions to every rule. So redundant text isn't always really bad for learning. Images aren't always superior to text. One of the exceptions is that when the linguistic complexity of what the instructor is saying is really complex or difficult, it's actually good to provide some visual text because it allows the learner to offload some of their cognitive burden onto that visual text support. So it's good in that context. Another exception is age, and this is something that we've looked at in more detail recently. And so we started asking questions like, do older learners relative to younger learners benefit from the same multimedia design strategies? And this is a really important question because I think we take for granted a lot of the times that our main participants are first-year undergrads, right? They range in age from late teens to early to mid-20s. And we take that sample as representative of an entire population of learners. When older adults are returning to school in higher numbers, there's online courses which offer instruction to older learners, and that's very attractive for them. And we have to pay attention to the fact that older and younger adults have fundamentally different cognitive architecture. Just as a function of normal age-related changes, typically they have reduced working memory capacity relative to younger adults. And maybe that drives different needs in terms of what they need for multimedia design. So recently we collaborated with the Baycrest Center for Geriatric Care, and we essentially tried to address this issue. So if you have a group of younger adults and a group of older adults, if you expose them to these 3 multimedia templates that you just saw, are there any learning differences in terms of what's good for one age group versus another? So again, they just saw one of these 3 presentations, learned as much as they could, completed a comprehension quiz at the end. And in terms of our results, we see a really nice replication of our previous research where the younger adults are performing the best in the complementary condition, where there's images versus redundant text. Now for our older adults, however, they seem to be benefiting from redundant text as opposed to the complementary images. And that's really interesting because clearly there's a dichotomy of depending on age group. So in terms of conclusions from this particular set of data, perhaps with redundant text, older adults are using that extra visual text as maybe some sort of environmental support. So if you take the assumption that they can't rely on working memory capacity as much, so they can't rely on those internal determinants of performance nearly as much. So they have to externalize their learning tasks and use external contextual aid like visual text to support their learning. Whereas for younger adults, reconciling competing sources of verbal input might really interfere with deep processing, and so it's a hindrance to their learning. Now, in terms of a complementary design, learning from images and narration does require some amount of coordination, so this coordinating between reconciling images and narration might be too complex for older adults, and they actually just would benefit from more visual text than this reconciliation of visual verbal information. Whereas our younger adults might actually benefit from this visual verbal combination, which optimizes their working memory capacity and allows them to learn information in the deepest meaningful way for them. So back full circle to why design instruction based on science. So the first reason that I tried to give you was that learning outcomes clearly differ depending on the visuals that you use. And on top of that, learner preference doesn't necessarily reflect effective design. In fact, students often prefer design that's bad for their learning. So we really need to rely on the science behind how to design instruction. And last but not least, cognitive ability, especially working memory, really influences the efficacy of design strategies. And so we have to have a good understanding of the underlying memory and attentional mechanisms that drive performance outcomes to not only know what's best within a population of learners, like younger adults, but across the lifespan. So my acknowledgements go out to lots of people. Yes.
We have time for a couple of quick questions.
Hi, thanks for the talk again. I'm just wondering, do you think the effect would differ depending on whether the multimedia presentation was user-paced as opposed to like paced by the instructor, like many online courses are?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of times we see just a change in performance outcomes just as a function of allowing a learner to essentially segment their presentation or pause or go at their own pace. And a lot of times we see that all of that visual text doesn't necessarily hinder learning if you provide, let's say, a learner control, such just as simple as being able to pause, which makes sense because you can, take in information at your own pace. And a lot of times, typically you read a lot faster than what you hear, so you're constantly reading ahead of what the auditory input is coming to you at, so you constantly have to reconcile that information. So yes, I think that a lot of times your outcomes will differ just as a function of learner control, and that's something that the literature does look at, and we're hoping to probably look at in the future, but I think that's very valid. Probably more so for online courses too, where you have the option of pausing, whereas live lectures, you don't necessarily,
Thanks, Barbara. That was a great talk. How would you advise me if I have to choose, for example, we have lectures that are video captures, so we can upload them on our learning management system just as a value-added piece. And if we're offered the opportunity here, the choice between having our computer feed captured along with the picture of us lecturing in the corner, or we cannot have the picture of us lecturing and just have the computer feed, the PowerPoint captured, which would you advise that I choose to promote?
That's an interesting question, and we actually, sometimes our multimedia templates had essentially a talking headshot in the corner, which would mimic what you're describing, and there was no difference in terms of how it influenced learning versus if there was no talking headshot. But it also probably, we have to take into consideration that this was a 9-minute presentation, so if you have an hour-long presentation with a talking headshot and then visuals, and then at that point there might be a breakdown of when that becomes a hindrance to learning, but I think that it would be okay depending on the duration of your presentation maybe that would count as extraneous input, but how long are your presentations or lectures typically?
About 50, 48 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, I think I've never actually tested it empirically, but at some point it might break down and become a problem. But with a 9-minute presentation, it's not. You can put the talking head shot along with it, but.
Hello, I'm over here.
Okay.
With respect to age, could it also be, other than working memory or the decline in memory, could it also be attributed to the fact that it's the interaction with digital images, the differences in interaction with digital images in your subject's lifetime. So your 20, 19-year-olds, they grew up with everything all around, whereas even my age ended up not so frenetic when it comes to imaging.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that we did control for in that study was technology exposure, but just in the way of, what do both groups of participants typically do with their computer use time, and but we never controlled for actually how much visual information they typically receive in terms of technology. But that's a great point, because I think that's probably true. I'm sure we're probably on YouTube a lot, which is purely visual and imagery, and maybe that contributes to it. But I think also that older adults typically have higher verbal ability, so their ability to use that visual text information might be at an advantage just because of their superior verbal ability as well. But I think that's definitely a valid point, and in the future it would be better to have some questions that really tap into the visual component in terms of imagery and how much exposure they have to it.
We have just two more quick questions.
Yeah, this will be short because I know Jeff wants the microphone. It was a really good talk. Thank you. Just an issue that I've struggled with a lot, and the issue of pictures being worth 1,000 words, and I like to use a lot of pictures. And you pointed out that in terms of their when you use the complementary strategies, that students actually do retain and learn more, right? But they want the text. This is a bit self-serving, but how much of this is because when you post those things, you post the text, and they can say, well, look, guess what you said? It was right there. It's written. But, often what we do is we put a picture up and we talk all over the picture, right? And they can't come back to you and say, well, I know what I said, but maybe they don't always know what you said in terms of the picture. I'm just wondering how much that colors their preference for wanting the redundant.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it's very comfortable to have all that text because you do have a record of information of what was spoken, and so you can go back and review in case you want to prove that, no, you were right and the instructor was wrong and that was not in your notes. So yeah, I definitely think that plays into it, but I think it's a very shallow level of learning that you get when you have all of that text-based information. But shallow is probably comfortable, and a lot of times students don't necessarily know what their education is going to get them in terms of the long term. So they're very happy learning it at a shallow level and getting a good grade immediately, but not really being able to transfer that long term. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl. So that ends the morning session, and we're running a little bit behind schedule, so we're going to come back from lunch instead of at 2:30 at 2:45. So we'll reconvene here at 2:45.